Oh, say, can you see? Hello, everyone. So, it's the Selborne Fisher scheme, and this is always a fun topic to start discussing, and it's always an interesting one to start bringing up, because there is so much written about it which is, quite frankly, wrong. That's just a simple way to put it. Wrong. It's one of those things that just comes out and people go, well, I have this idea. It's about class. It's about this. It's about that. And you're going, really, it's not. The entire thing is about as far from a class war as you can possibly get. It's certainly interpreted as a class war by some at the time, but it's not a class war. Its entire purpose is about trying to train officers to be interchangeable to enough of extent that you don't have officers aboard ships which have different, who might rank in at the same, but if let's say you lose all your warfighting or all your ship's officers, your navigation officers, the engineering officers are going to be the last officer left in charge, but they're not going to know how to navigate the ship. Well, that's pretty darn stupid. If you think about it, the Selborne Fisher scheme is entirely about war-proofing the fleet and war-proofing the navy and making it actually fit for the modern world. But it doesn't necessarily get to go that way. Now, the sources I've used there, I'm going to do something different about than I usually do. I'm going to actually discuss them a little bit. I've used three principal sources for doing some of today's discussions. The Influence of History on Sea Power, the Royal Navy, and the Lessons of 1914-1918 by Arthur Marder. He's got a book as well, but I used his actual journal article rather than his book because, well, yeah. The British Navy Between the Wars by Commodore James Goldrick. That was what he was at the time, and that was published in 2011. And the Selborne scheme by the Dreadnought Project, which is always pretty good. The Dreadnought Project tends to be a source I do go to for a lot of information. And why have I got these listed here? Well, because I'm going to give you an example of the difference between the two. On the left, as you're looking at the screen, we have an excerpt from the Influence of History on Sea Power. As you'll notice, Marder writes, I attribute the lamentable failure to develop the fleet arm in the interwar years as much to the battleship complex from which the Navy suffered, for within the Navy itself there was by no means wholehearted support for the fight to regain and develop its own tactical air component. Pro-battleship faction, misreading lessons of First World War, was very powerful and regarded the onset of the fleet arm with profound distaste, not only from the point of view of potential challenge to the supremacy of the battleship, but also from the point of view of draining resources away from the big gun. He then goes on to an extent, misquote Caspar John, but we'll leave that to one side. It's not misquoting, but it's certainly taking sections out of context. And on the other side, we have the section from Goldrick. Now, let's look at the aircraft carrier. Please do not have the picture of the American supercarriers in mind when you think about the aircraft carrier. Do not even have the picture of the attack on Pearl Harbor, of the Coral Sea and Midway in your mind when you think of the 1920s and even most of the 1930s. Why? Because it took the best part of 20 years after World War I for the combination of new technological systems and procedures and proven in-service capabilities to come together to make effective weapon systems. It really only happened from about 1937 onwards, with the advent of metal skin monoplanes with more powerful engines. The British were, for many reasons, 3 or 4 years behind in this development, a few years of which, in strategic terms, were to prove critical. Let me give you an example of the problems which British aircraft carriers had around 1930. First, carrier aircraft could not easily fly at night. That means that the aircraft carrier was ineffective up to 50% of the time. Second, aircraft carrier and carrier operations were weather limited, as were shore bases, a point sometimes neglected by advocates of shore-based air power. If the wind was above about 4-6 with an accompanying high sea state, they couldn't fly, and they couldn't fly in low visibility. In northern European waters, the combination of these two factors probably accounted for another 15% by most sailor estimate. Thus, you have a powerful and very expensive weapon system, and aircraft carriers with their air groups cost a lot more than battleships, which is ineffective for up to 65% of the time. This perhaps explains why aircraft carriers in the 1920s were armed with the same sort of guns as a cruiser. As exercise showed, they often had to defend themselves. It also partly explains why carrier came and flourished in the clearer air of the Pacific, where in any case, the distances were much greater and the potential land air bases were more widely distributed. Now, here's the thing. This is the point about being an academic and using sources. I disagree with both of these authors. They're both very good authors who I read the works of, but I can pull both of their points apart. I can pull Marder's here on the battleship-centric Navy apart completely and just go, well, okay, the Royal Navy puts the first rear admiral aircraft carriers in charge of it has from like 30 to 1933 and puts them in charge of their carrier procurement, and the first thing they do is procure Ark Royal, followed by the Illustrious class and Unicorn, and sets in trail all sorts of things. So yeah, they're about as carrier-minded as they can be. And the good point there, which Goldrick raised, is the realities of naval aviation for much of this period. Naval aviation is not what it becomes for most of this period. So there are good reasons to be spending money on battleships. But the fact is, no one's spending money on much anything at this point. You know, you can't claim the Navy's battleship-centric when they've built 2 battleships in the 1920s, as they were allowed by treaties. The rest of the time, the most common capital ship to come to service in that period is an aircraft carrier, conversions. And then they ordered the Ark Royal, and when they're ordering the King George V, they order 5 battleships at the same point as they're ordering 6 aircraft carriers. Oh, and Unicorn. So, yeah, that doesn't sound like a battleship-centric Navy. You can make the case for a gun-centric Navy and torpedo-centric Navy for a ship-centric Navy, because they are focused on their destroyer production, and they are focused on their cruiser production, but that's what they're allowed to do under treaties. I think a lot of the reasons why the battleship-centric Navy idea holds on is because there's a large number of people who put out the idea that after World War I, Navy shouldn't have been battleship-centric anymore. They should have learnt a lesson in World War I, which of course they didn't, because that isn't the lesson you got from World War I. Battleships are still the arbiters of things at the end of World War I. And as we've been over in previous points, battleships are still an arbiter into World War II. But the point is, there are a lot of lessons to be learnt. And the reason why both these sources are very interesting, despite me disagreeing with points in them, is because both of them cover the lessons learnt the Royal Navy learnt from the end of World War I and how they developed in the interwar years. Which is important because the Selborne scheme runs really from 1905 to 1919, which means it covers World War I. And it also means that those are the officers who are then going to be writing the lessons learnt from World War I. Because if you consider it, you've been in the service for 14 years by that point. You're going to be at the level of a staff officer, especially with World War I experience, staff officer, lieutenant commander rank, where you're probably going to be writing up the lessons learned. So suddenly it has a big impact on the interwar period, and the best way to assess it is to assess it through the interwar period. And this is what Lord Selborne himself says about the scheme in 1926. My lords, I have taken no part in this controversy, but now that it has been erased in your lordship's house, like my noble friend who has just spoken, I feel I cannot properly keep silent. The 2 noble dukes who have already addressed your lordships have alluded to the history of this question, but they will permit me to say that they have not recited that history absolutely correctly. I think it's very pertinent to the just consideration of this question that your lordships should be reminded of what led up to the orders of 1902 and what was, as a matter of fact, affected by those orders. Before I come to that, I want your lordships to remember that the present engineering officers of the Navy may be roughly divided into three classes. There are the old naval engineer officers who were naval engineering officers before 1902. There were, as have always been, by my noble friend the Duke of Northumberland, given status in the military branch of the Navy in January 1st, 1915, as a reward for war service, a privilege that they prized quite beyond anything that your lordships as civilians can fully understand. Then there are the young officers who entered under the 1902 scheme and who had always been classified within executive officers of the Navy until this order, to which my noble friend is drawing attention, was issued. In 1922, there was a modification of that scheme, and naval officers who had become engineers under that modification in 1922 were expressly promised in that modification that they should remain in the military branch. Therefore, you have these three class officers, all of whom they think have a real grievance arising out of the recent Admiralty order. The scheme of 1902 is generally known as the Selborne-Fisher scheme, but it would be much more correct to call it the Selborne-Kerr-Fisher scheme, because Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Walter Kerr, who I'm glad to say is still with us today, was the first Sea Lord. Lord Fisher was second Sea Lord. Lord Walter Kerr was an officer of the old school who never would dream of agreeing to a change on mere grounds of theory. He would never agree unless he thought an important change was essential to the good of the service. I think a great deal, too much stress has been laid on Lord Fisher's name in this matter. Lord Walter Kerr was just as responsible for the scheme as Lord Fisher, but Lord Fisher, as the second Sea Lord, was the particular member of the Board of Admiralty who had the work of administering the scheme. Under the scheme, there was to be a common entry for the officers of the Navy, and they were to specialise when they reached the rank of lieutenant, and decide whether they would become engineering officers or not. It is true that there was a hope expressed, and we entertained the hope, that subsequently there would be a certain measure of interchangeability between the executive officers and the engineering officers, but we never felt any certainty on that subject, and it's a complete mistake on the part of the Duke of Montrose to think that the interchangeability was an essential and permanent part of the scheme. Which is kind of interesting, I know what I just said, when actually it was part of the scheme. It was a measure of, not a measure of the permanent interchangeability, we could take engineers, put them in executive branches, etc. But it meant that an engineer in an emergency could fulfill the executive roles. They would have the necessary skill and training, and an executive officer in an emergency could go and run the engineering department. They could be the officer necessarily in there. They could support the officers and the NCOs down there. They would have enough knowledge of engineering to be able to fill in a pinch. When you think about it from the perspective of damage control and those things, it's actually a very modern scheme. And very sensible. These are your revolutionaries. Lord Selborne, let's see, he goes off to become governor of Africa. Yeah. First class degree in history. So I have a lot of support for him. Served as Member of Parliament from 1882 to 1895, so 13 years. As an MP. Then when his father died, well, he tried to stay serving in the House, but they decided to have an actual vote, a forced by-election. Writ was passed, not a right. I do love Microsoft Office. Then there's Lord Fisher. Okay, I've talked about him before. He's fairly revolutionary. He certainly has the ego to be a revolutionary, but he's not really revolutionary in this scheme. He's got a problem he's dealing with. That's his choice of flagship. Less powerful, but faster battleship. Second-class battleship, HMS Renown. He brought her from the North American West Indies station with him to Mediterranean. He preferred her to the other options. He had a ship trained up to what he needed. Why change? The fact is, He's looking at a navy which is becoming increasingly technologically focused. And he needs to find a way to get the executive branch to be as technologically understanding as possible. It's one of those classic scenarios, and it's one of the problems you get with modern navy sometimes. So you have a focus nowadays on STEM: science, technology, engineering, and maths. Very useful, very important, especially for understanding the tech side of it. However, you end up with a problem when that's all they are. It's like you end up with a problem where you have executive officers who don't understand STEM, who don't understand the science, technology, engineering, maths of their ships, don't have an understanding enough of it to understand what their tech officers are saying. You don't need to understand enough to fix it. You need to have an understand enough to be able to tell when the tech officer when the engineering officer is telling you there's a problem, and so you can gauge what you can do to support them and what they might need. It's a problem of leadership, which Fisher is dealing with and which Care is dealing with. You cannot afford to be in a scenario as a commanding officer where you don't know enough to understand when your officer is in trouble and is needing help. You don't need enough to be able to do the fixing yourself. You don't need that. It's kind of like, let's say you're put a director of a show, a West End musical. You won't know how to run the lights. You won't know how to necessarily manage the stage. You won't know how to deal with the engineering, and you won't know all sort of the writing and all the things that go into that. Those aren't your area of expertise. But you need to know enough that you can work with the people in those areas and understand when they're explaining stuff to you what the problems are. And also, it helps when you're cajoling them, motivating them, if you understand those problems. So that's the scenario you're dealing with. This is Lord Care. Doesn't exactly look like a revolutionary, does he? He's first Sea Lord at the time with the reforms going through. This is HMS Trafalgar, which was his first flagship. Again, we're looking at an officer who is not revolutionary. He's a very good officer. He's not a revolutionary. So these are really the three names behind the scheme, but the scheme is drawn up by the Admiralty, and it's part of a wider program to try and bring more science, A, to the study of war, but B, to the understanding of what warfare entails, to improve the Royal Navy, to take it to the point at which it can make best use of the technology it has available on a strategic level, as well as a tactical level and an operational level. So it's not just about career tracks, it's also about bricks and mortars. You have different things taking part at different levels. The focus of the scheme is often on its thing to do with entry. Now, boys enter as naval cadets between the ages of 12 and 13. At the current time, they studied for 2 years at the Royal Naval College, Osborne, 2 years at Dartmouth, and then a period of training on a training cruiser at sea before joining the fleet as a midshipman. After 2 to 3 years sea service, the teenagers could then qualify for the rank of acting sub-lieutenant, confirmed after passing all the examinations for the rank of lieutenant. As lieutenants, they could then specialize in gunnery, torpedo, navigation duties as normal, and eventually signaling duties. The Selborne scheme introduces to this the specialization of engineering, and also created that of Marine as well. So basically, the idea was you'd carry on as normal, but now instead of you going off and starting off as an engineering officer and going through and always being an engineering officer, no, they take everyone in and they go through the same process, and then they go off and become an engineer, or they become a navigator, or a torpedo officer, or a gunnery officer, or a marine. It was envisaged that the officers of various specializations, of all these specializations, would be to an extent interchangeable. Not completely interchangeable, but to an extent able to take over from each other in emergencies, also to assist each other in emergencies. And they'd revert to general duties by the time they reach the rank of captain. So you'd have captains who would appear, who would have a specialization where they were a deep knowledge person on, but they would have good knowledge on all these other areas. And they'd probably reach that level by the time they reach commander, when they were the executive officer of a ship. It was planned, though, that engineering officers could elect to specialize further and specialize as engineering officers for the remainder of their career. And the Marines would gain naval ranks, so would become commanders M and captains M, and would specialize in that. It doesn't really work out that well. They have this lovely plan drawn up, and you can see what it's for. Osborne, Dartmouth, training cruiser, and exactly, where they end up and how they get there. But, and I say this gloriously, there is also more going on than just this at the beginning. There's also the Royal Navy Naval War College. Exists 1900-1914, starts off at Greenwich, then moves to Plymouth, then Portsmouth, then returns to Greenwich. And whilst it theoretically ends in 1914, we have this thing of that the then Rear Admiral Herbert W. Richmond is listed as being president of the RN War College, Greenwich, and then Rear Admiral in Charge, Senior Officers Course, February 1919 to November 1922. And the Senior Officers Course is an interesting continuation of the War College. So that still goes on. There's also what they're doing with the bricks and mortar. There's the fact that the Britannia Royal Navy College Dartmouth is built between 1902 and 1905. So that building, the building you can see at the front of the picture, not the building you can see at the back, the sort of brick thing that's built further up the hill behind it, which kind of spoils the view in a way. We'll leave that to one side. The lovely, lovely construction in the front with the beautiful flags, parade ground, and the various nice, very nice looking building. That's what's built between 1902 and 5. And the whole plan is also that the Royal Naval Engineering College, Keam, will be closed down, with its work moved to Greenwich, really, which fulfills its role as the University of the Navy. And in fact, the 1902 memorandum, as Selborne states out, it is decided henceforth, all officers for the executive and engineering branch of the Navy and the Royal Marines shall enter the service as naval cadets under exactly the same conditions between the ages of 12 and 13. That these cadets shall be trained on exactly the same system until they shall have passed for the rank of sub-lieutenants between the ages of 19 and 20. That about the age of 20, these sub-lieutenants shall be distributed between the three branches of the service, which are essential to the fighting efficiency of the fleet: the executive, the engineer, and the marine. Now, broadly speaking, the executive would include torpedo, gunnery, navigation, and signal duties. So basically, you would specialize sub in any one of those areas. The problems that are created from this are many and varied. But basically, it comes down to, whilst the Navy made it clear that no nominations be given to boys whose parents or guardians do not declare for them that they are prepared to enter any of one of the three branches of the service at termination of their probation period of service afloat, as far as possible, each officer will be allowed to choose, though, which branch of service he would join, but this must be subject to proviso that all alike are satisfactorily filled, as Captain Roslyn Weymouth of Osborne noted in 1905 in letter to Vischer. Tendency on the part of parents and some connected to Osborne to hope at least their sons might never become lieutenants engineering, with no chance of commanding ships or fleets, and I have suspicion that for this reason they have in some cases even discouraged their sons in their engineering studies. The fear was that your son would become an engineer and he'd forever be trapped in second class. Whereas the whole point of it was that actually, no, engineers could go off, could get up to lieutenant commander, and from there could go off to become a commander. Could transfer back into the executive branch and go up and become commander, captain. And the whole point was that would be good because then you'd have people with knowledge of engineering becoming senior officers. Not just admirals of engineering in charge of the dockyards and running those things. No, you'd have actual officers who have an engineering background in command of ships. Maybe going on to being admirals, serving on the staffs as admirals. Wow. That's revolutionary. There is a big problem with communication when it comes to the scheme. There's a lot of misunderstandings about what it would have done and what it could have done. I actually think it would have been far more capable, but how do I put this? Everything Fisher does right when it comes to selling the dreadnoughts and selling his battleship program and his battle cruisers, he does wrong when it comes to selling the Selborne Fisher scheme. And it becomes, in many ways, much more of a lightning rod than it should do for his detractors. Because, honestly, they should have all been quite supportive of this one. It was the way navies were going. The idea that you could have a senior officer who had no understanding of how his ship was run, or their ship was run, and no understanding of how it moved through the water and powered itself, is something which is a massive problem. You can't have that. And there were a few officers who were going, well, it's always been, the executive branch, da-da-da-da-da. Well, hang on, if you consider in the Age of Sail, the officers knew about sailing their ships. They knew about their sails. Yes, you had a sailing master, but the whole was to train the young gentlemen in how to sail a ship. And the young gentlemen were the midshipmen. They would have a schoolmaster aboard who would teach them the maths and various other sort of things, but they would also spend a lot of time with the sailing master, and it was part of their lieutenant's exams, navigations, and how to sail a ship. You need, therefore, if your officers had to understand sails, they need to understand engines. They need to understand the engineering. Just as much as they need to understand the guns and where they are in the world, the stars. And this is an attempt to fix that. And this is a cool Blackburn dart because there's going to be a lot of, and I mean this, a lot of slides of just text, just writing. It's a problem, really. It's a problem because for the Royal Navy, it was how to manage it. It's still getting over the late Victorian period, the 1840s, 50s onwards to about the 1890s. They have a big legacy. They have a legacy of some very interesting decisions. But they also have because of the Royal Navy's growing importance, a growing view of aristocracy of naval officers. And you get a lot of sons of noble houses coming involved because it's a status to be in the Navy, now. And because of that, there is a status associated with engineering. Engineering is dirty. Engineering, you wear overalls. Engineering, you work with your hands and you can get oily and messy, and these things do not attract themselves to aristocratic parents at a time. It's a shame, really. So opposition comes from various points. I prefer the assessment of the Dreadnought projects on this one. There can be no doubt that there was strong opposition to the Selborne scheme. However, What Marder termed objections of a snobbish nature aside, it's also clear that much opposition was based on incorrect information regarding the scheme. It's all very well for Marder to damn people who had not informed themselves as to the real nature of the Admiralty scheme, but it suggests a real failure on the part of the Admiralty to present this case for the scheme, details of the Selborne scheme, not only to the public but to the Navy itself. What the Navy really needed to do was take out full-page ads explaining the scheme in every major newspaper. That was it. They need to explain what the scheme was and why they were doing it. Very simple. And you get points like this. This is the point made by Admiral Sir Lewis A. Beaumont, Commander-in-Chief Plymouth. The fundamental change which has been brought about by the common entry has already disturbed the service in a great measure. And speaking for myself, I do not think that it has the goodwill of the service. Generally, I do not mean the common entry alone, but what follows from common entry, i.e. the fact that people are having to compete on merit. I know. You might actually get the best of people for the job, doing the job. It's terrible. In their minority report on the Douglas Committee, Rear Admiral Logan, Commodore Briggs, and Captain Bacon, in opposing the inclusion in the engineering branch and the military branch, made direct reference to the Selborne scheme reforms. As officers in touch with the seagoing fleets, we would also remind their lordships that the great changes which have taken place in the Navy during the past 2 years have created a great feeling of unrest and uncertainty, which only loyalty has in measure recently soothed. It is very desirable, therefore, to introduce at the present moment any further important changes which are not absolutely necessary. Yes. It's a great, terrible change. First officer from Osborne, who'd gone through the Osborne scheme, and Osborne, remember, was built newly to accommodate this increase in officers. The Regent Captain was Harold T.C. Walker on the 31st of December 1931. Engineers. The first 17 officers selected to specialise in engineering were appointed to Royal Navy College, Greenwich, on the 1st of October 1913. The first promotion to the rank of Captain Engineering occurred on the 30th of June 1936, with the promotion of John B. Sidgwick and Dennis C. Ford, who had entered Osborne in January 1904 and September 1903, respectively. Takes a long time to get ahead in engineering. The big problem for it all was the Royal Marines, because the Royal Marines, they just don't get no love. It's not like today, where they are an elite which basically have to whack away recruits with a baseball bat and a cricket bat at the same time. Going, whack, whack, keep away, we're going to be selective. In this period, it was very difficult for them to get people. And basically, between 1907 and 1911, they had two, really. And those actually didn't join till 1912. That's because whilst engineering did okay and executive did okay, who wants to become a Marine? And especially when you're only going to sit in a turret and be occasionally sent off for a shore duty and you've got limited chance of promotion, all those sort of things. Charles H. Congdon retired as a lieutenant colonel, and Robert G. Sturgis was knighted and reached the rank of lieutenant general. They did well. I think there's a real problem here in that, again, that would have been a really effective thing if it had worked. You would have ended up with Royal Marines who understood the naval side and naval officers who understood the Royal Marine side far more, especially if you'd had the genuine capability of, and it had been maintained, once you reach Lieutenant Commander, You can then go back to Greenwich, do your staff course, your war college course, etc. And then from that point you can learn. You can go and command ships. You can go become an executive officer, and you can go up the executive branch. It would have been a really good way to run the service, and it could have been a really useful way to run the service because it would have provided you with a lot of senior officers who understood the variations on things and what was variations on the actual naval duties. It's kind of interesting because when we consider quite a lot of systems which are designed for science fiction, they're not too far dissimilar or too far removed from the Selborne Fisher scheme as it's intended to operate. Longer term impact. Well, it's the inheritance of the Naval War College and the scientific approach to naval education. I'm going to be more free in discussing this in the live. The live is going to be probably the full 3 hours, but this is going to be a slightly shorter video. Now, when you've got the scientific approach to naval education, and if you consider the whole system where there have been various forms of classification, interviews, etc., at the entry points, there'd also been education further on, the War College and a few other things going on. After World War One, these sort of split up into two groups. You have the Naval Staff College, started in 1919 at Greenwich. Lord Beatty describes as such naval disasters occurred during the war were the direct result of the lack of sufficient and efficient staff. We paid very dearly for the experience which led to its formation, and nothing should interfere with its development. Okay, this is coming from the officer who put an officer who I am not going to name in post as his flag officer and signals officer, who didn't have the experience, training, etc. necessary to it, turning up his nose at Somerville, who was very well trained and who was then snapped up by the Mediterranean as fast as anything. Because he wanted the connections of the other guy. Yeah. If anyone needed to have decent staff officers and needed to be selecting from a pool of limited staff officers, it's Beatty. Godfrey stated there the main aim of the course was to broaden the mind to the study of war and to make officers think. There are some people who go so far as to claim that these two schools together, the Staff College and Tactical School, are the reason why the Royal Navy doesn't get everything right, but makes very few mistakes during World War II. It makes a lot less mistakes than it might otherwise have made. I'm not sure I quite agree with that, but I do think these have a major impact on the Navy. The Naval Tactical School is especially important. Admiral Henderson makes a great deal of use for it. He basically uses it to replace what had been the war course, in that he sends his ship designs and the ship theory to go and be reviewed by it. And so the tactical school starts off in Portsmouth. It wanders around, kind of like the war course did. It had been proposed by, unsurprisingly, Jellicoe's former chief of staff and flag captain, Admiral Sir Frederick Dreyer. Then wrote a more scientific study of naval tactics, and was primarily responsible for drafting the battle instructions and from 1939 the fighting instructions. So those would be published by the Admiralty, but they'd be drafted to a large degree by the tactical school. It's always interesting to read those documents and go, "Ooh, this is what people are thinking." And this, of course, is Admiral Henderson. When he's third Sea Lord, especially from 1933 onwards, he really gets the Naval Tactical School and the Staff College as much as he can involved in the designing, developing, and the profiling of the Navy as it needs to be in what's the plan for war, which is they think it's going to be from 1942 at some point. So remember, 1932, that's when the 10-year rule ends, and they think they're going to have war in 1942 after that. So they're preparing for that. And he is challenging these two groups especially to look at the future and think for the future. Now, yes, they do have such issues as occasionally have to refight the Battle of Jutland, that's one of the battles which they come and look at, rather like the US do. But they spend most of their time looking at fighting convoy battles, at fighting, doing various raids around the world, at global operations, in fact, and how you distribute forces. There are some good points, some bad points about it. I can guarantee Marder focuses a lot on the fact that battleships feature a lot in their calculations, but there again, battleships feature a lot in everyone's calculations in the 1920s and 1930s. If you're expecting a navy to not be considering battleships in those periods, then you're expecting them to be operating with a level of hindsight which no one's going to achieve unless they're Doctor Who. Unless they can time travel, they ain't going to do that. So this is what you have to deal with. The scheme runs 1905 to 1919 for 14 years. You get to World War II, that's roughly 20 years after then. So the officers who are mostly going to be in charge of ships in World War II, the officers who are going to be Commodores, Rear Admirals in World War II, are officers who came through the scheme. Yes, some of the senior officers are not. They're going to have got through before the scheme went in place. But a lot of the officers, the vast bulk of the officers, are the product of that scheme. So the Royal Navy's performance in World War II is directly attributable to the Fisher-Selborne scheme. And I don't think they do too bad a job. One of the interesting things that you consider about this is, though, that there is an interview part of the process very early on. And you think about it, if you're interviewing a 12-year-old boy and trying to figure out what they're going to be like as an adult, I can only think of myself at 12, and I think I must have changed rather a lot. And this is one of the weaknesses I see in this scheme. And this is pointed out by Vincent W. Badley, who was the Assistant Private Secretary to the First Lord, who served on a sixth committee which sat in February 1905. The present committee found that, so far from having much difficulty in classifying the candidates, it could safely subdivide the large middle of beta class still further. This resulted in the following classification of that committee's results. A plus 2, good. B plus 5, good. And so forth. They had all sorts of fun trying to classify them, and there are points where they're having success with it and points where they're not. As one person wrote, as the committee became more experienced, they moved a little from script. It is fairly easy to see that asking a 12-year-old what was the lowest London cab fare, or how much a piece of luggage cost to carry in a cab, or what sort of animals or birds would be regarded as game in this country, or with what he should eat caper sauce, applesauce, or currant jelly, or how he should address a duchess, king, or bishop, could establish a social background. The connection between that last question and the relative performance of a clergyman and doctor's son is pretty obvious. He was to be asked other questions that more directly addressed general knowledge, like, what are the chief agricultural crops grown in England? Though the landed interest might benefit from that one, or what are the principal railways of England? There are some imperialist questions, like asking the names of 8 of England's colonies or 6 island colonies of the British Empire, some more directly naval. What is a light ship and a buoy, and what are they used for? As time went on, there was various people used for the committee. For example, to try and improve their understanding of boys and what young ones might say, they brought in the canon, the Honourable Edward Littleton, the headmaster of Hailbury, and soon after that point, headmaster of Eton College, who, November 1904, wrote after the committee, I think we gradually learned how to depend less on set questions and more on making the boys talk freely, in tempting them to them with sufficient questions to see if they knew what they were saying. And one gentleman did remember being asked. I remember being asked how many arches there were to Bideford Bridge, and I caused a great deal of movement because I was surprised that I didn't know. Later asked me why. Later they asked me why I always talked in a sing-song voice, and that rather upset me. That was a question in 1912. I think the whole process is full of issues. And I know this is the summary point, and this is the point where I'm trying to wrap it up in a way that is different, but is also complementary to live. Saying that out loud. The point you have to remember with the whole process, with the interview, the qualifying exam, the length of training, and the fact that everything's provided towards getting a smart, well-rounded young man, and at this point they are just focusing on young men, into training, giving them as much of as wider naval knowledge and references as possible, so they understand the Navy as intimately as they can, and letting them then hopefully choose the specialization which best suits them. But if they don't choose it, then cajoling them to go and do the specialization which best suits their knowledge and aptitude to best serve the Navy, and giving the opportunity of then going back, either continuing to specialize or going back and going into the executive and command route, is designed to provide the Royal Navy with as wide a pool of experienced and skilled officers as possible at every level. But they've also done a system which at its very base point is changing a system which has been in existence. And when I say it's been in existence, it hasn't actually been in existence, it has been being adapted for over a century. And that's the problem. The system you've got at this point, prior to this, is more of an evolution than a creation. This, therefore, seems revolutionary by default because no one ever really set up the previous system. It just sort of came into being and was sort of recognized as such. And that scares people because suddenly they've got change, and it's change which they don't feel in control of. And there are lots of factions, lots of different groups, which felt they had influence and power over the original system. What's probably worse for them, though, in those groups is that they eventually do bring down the Selborne-Fisher scheme in the 1920s, 1919, 1922 period, and it doesn't revert to the old system at all. It changes again. And it changes again in World War II, and it changes again in the 1960s, it changes again in the 1990s, and we currently have the system we have today, which is again different than it was before. Has it got better every time? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. But we learned. So, the question for this video. How would you sell the Selborne-Fisher scheme to the public and to the Navy? How would you have got them to support it? And how radical do you think you'd have been to get them to support it? Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for your support. As ever, all the likes, all the super chats, all the super thanks, all the shares, all the membership, all the subscriptions, all the patrons, everything, all that, it adds up. It all helps with circulation, helps get the things working, and gets more people to hear about naval history, which is what I love. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care, and have a nice day.